there should be a presentation come up now. If
we can see that.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
fine.
okay, good. Well, thank you very much for your time, and of course to Rebecca and Chris for arranging this. John Boucher is on the line as well. His big part we won't have time to talk about, so that might be another presentation, but we'll briefly mention it. Soon there'll be a question as to what you actually want us to cover, because this is a big subject, of course. But what we're assuming part of it is how can the Isle of Man get emissions to zero in 29 years time, 28 and a half years time, without us all losing our jobs, without ruining the economy, without spoiling our modern lives, or looking more positively, will it actually be a great thing for the Isle of Man? And part of the issue is everybody engaged, and perhaps not yet. It is worth noting obsolescence can happen really quickly now. It's 14 years since the first iPhone, and there's things like Blackberries that no longer exist. So and videotapes, of course. So things can move quickly when they start moving, and I think it is moving quickly now. So we just want to make sure the Isle of Man isn't left behind, or actually might be leading some part of it. So we'll cover 6 parts. Some of them are long, some short, but there is a question here, and this is to whoever wants to answer it. This is the why bother bit. Now, this is a part I added later because of some, I found out there were some questions from potential participants about, again, back to whether climate change is actually as bad as people think. So I don't know if you want a hands up on that, but I've got probably a 10-minute part on what is actually happening to the climate. I'm trying to judge whether you just want us to get straight into how the Isle of Man can move forward. So put your hands up if you think we should do a little bit on climate change or not. No, let's say hands up if you want something on climate change.
I mean, let's see what people say. But I mean, one of the founding principles for this group was it's not here to debate whether it's happening.
Right.
We're looking at what to do given that it's happening.
Yes, good. Okay. Well, what I'll do is miss that part out, but I'll put it in. You can have a copy of the slides, and I'll leave it in the copy of the slides.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think and we always come back to it if people have specific questions want to ask.
So what I'll do, just so we don't interrupt the talk amongst yourself, I'll just hide those now. It's also on our website. So I just was aware of a question and a comment on email, which is why I thought I'd add it in, or give you the option, and I'm glad we'll move quickly on to that. So what does it all mean to us? Can the Isle of Man benefit from this? And this is what we're calling the Green Energy Hub. One slide on what we're about, the Energy and Sustainability Centre, and then some conclusions. There's less fewer pie charts and graphs in the presentation now, but they're still there. There is numbers involved. It's a key part of what's happening to see whether things are possible and affordable. So I'm actually going to start with a vision. Imagine this is the Isle of Man in perhaps 2035. You can see there are various. So we're going to focus on energy today, but you can see there's some speculative ideas here. I mean, offshore wind is a commercial and well-established technology. There's onshore solar parks there up in the north. There are some other things which we'll talk about, which is pumped hydro storage, some new concepts, and then links, interconnectors both to the UK and to Ireland, because we feel there's sales to be made here, export potential, not just trying to find the cheapest way to get to net zero. And so to give some idea of what potentially things, and there's a biomass power station there as well. To give some idea, the Isle of Man probably in the future will need about 1.5 terawatt hours per year. Just to give you, that's our use. It may get up to 2 terawatt hours because of the way energy is converted. But just to give you what the value might be, for instance, you may have heard that BP has some now Irish Sea licenses just east of the Isle of Man. And they are paying per year £231 million just for the license. This is no contract, nothing. This is just to investigate. So they're committing to almost £1 billion in 4.5 years. That's 20% of Isle of Man offshore acreage. And the reason they're paying that is there's not much acreage left. That is shallow water. The Isle of Man is shallow water. That's less than 40 meters, and windy. The Irish Sea is particularly windy, as you know. Now, 800 square kilometers, when the wind doesn't blow all the time, but would produce about 12 terawatt hours. So a lot more than the Isle of Man requires. And I've put the assumption here that if we balance it, so it's stabilized electricity and sell it to the UK or Ireland, that at current prices is worth about £800 million a year if you sell it when those countries need it. And based largely on UK figures, with a fully green economy can add about 600 to 1,000 new jobs in the Isle of Man. So this is a big deal. So where did we go wrong? Why have we got ourselves into this problem? So this is probably the only bit on climate change. If only we weren't fossil fuel dependent. We're always looking for something to blame geology, whether that's fossil fuels or Henry Ford. But what the thing is now, we'd say maybe the cheapest path, which was oil at one stage, is not always the right one. So the Isle of Man, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Has much happened yet? Not really. You will be aware of rumors, but lots will have to happen pretty quickly. Of course, the engagement part, making sure people are behind this, and the elections are an interesting hurdle. There will be training required, and the most important part is legislation, and that can be optimized for the Isle of Man. Some people see it as a threat. It's a bit muddled at the moment, and I think that's true everywhere. That's not unusual to the Isle of Man, but there is potentially a lot of benefit. Can you afford to ignore it? Which, I'm ex-oil industry, and there's a lot of oil companies burying their heads in the sand. And you say you cannot afford to ignore it. It's purely from selfish reasons. You will be out of business if you're a fossil fuel company in 20 years. You won't be in business if you don't engage low carbon energy as well. As we know, maybe people are not quite as informed and as engaged. And I'd put governments in there. The UK government, some of the things they're promising are virtually impossible. What's said isn't always realistic. And of course, many people want to do the right thing. So there is an element also of just behavior. That's an important thing. And then can you just wait till everybody else is sorted out, and then we could just step in? Well, yes, but that's where you'll lose value, and your carbon footprint in the meantime is pretty high. So 840,000 tons of carbon dioxide direct emissions per year. That's not including our purchases, it's sort of slightly equally distributed between electricity, heating, takes up a large part of the Isle of Man's energy budget, of course, and then transport. We have a lot of private cars, but more than 95% is from fossil fuels. So this is going to be a big change. the current report came out in end of October 2019. Things moved pretty quickly, and we're now waiting for royal assent on the climate change bill, which is called the Climate Change Bill 2020. Legislative Council had big input. There's been several readings, but also in December 20, this is the key part, Arup have been appointed to model future energy scenarios, and that's maybe a bit we'll talk off the record about. Okay, so this may be a part we don't. Maybe we'll leave this to the end. Actually, maybe that's the best thing. We'll leave this part to the end, and this is just saying where I suppose the climate change transformation team has got to, and where they need to get to. And so let's do that at the end, and then I don't need to interrupt the flow. But what we've realized is, just from a personal point of view, but also from the nation, it's a very complex, tricky problem to get, let's say challenge. It's not a problem, but it's a challenge to get the optimum energy system for the Isle of Man. It will be an entirely new energy system. All our other behaviors will also be low carbon or net zero, but there are lots of options. And we thought one way of bringing this to the front is actually making something like a set of top trump cards, because all of them have advantages and all of them have disadvantages. And to be honest, to make it work on the Isle of Man, you need to balance these. There's not one or two solutions that there's not one or two options that are true solutions. It's going to be a mix, and that mix, to optimize that, is going to take a lot of work, and that's what hasn't happened yet. And what we feel is the better way to do it is engage everybody in this, and this is why we've almost, I mean, it seems like dumbing it down, but in some respects it allows people to say what they think. Do they actually want a modular nuclear fission reactor on the Isle of Man, which is an option? I would suspect most people will say no, but there are some people may. And then you say, well, what would we have to do to make that work with other things? I think most of us are thinking wind will be part of it, but it should be onshore or offshore. There are advantages and disadvantages. It's not just cost, but it's also the things like ancillary services to make sure the frequencies on causing the system to crash, so that the grid is strong enough for it. So that's what we're trying to say is advantages, disadvantages, but you can build a system that would be not only optimized, but would have most people's support, we feel. And we'll come back to this. If we don't do it, certainly on a world scale, then, as you know, lots of big issues. The bottom line is the important one for those that are cynical about it. Our modern lifestyle ends. That's it. So we better adapt rather than wait for the inevitable. And as I say, we'll put up the slides and the bit about how climate change is actually occurring. You can read if you're still uncertain about that. Now, companies are already reacting. They don't have to. Many aren't yet. But you probably all got this through the door. Manx gas is now carbon neutral. So we asked the question: is it actually carbon neutral? How would you make Manx gas carbon neutral? Because it's methane, and that's carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms. And in 2019, just for heating and cooking, Manx gas sales were 1.1 billion cubic feet. Now, that's equivalent to about 75,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions, because it's not just you burning it, also the production and transport of the gas produces an additional carbon footprint. Now, John and I have been looking at different costs of tons per carbon dioxide, and it depends what you do with it. But I actually think a real world cost, if you're going to put it into trees, for instance, when you take the cost of land into account, is round the world, this is a real world cost, is about £25 per ton of carbon dioxide. And now you'll see the numbers are much lower at the moment, but looking in the future, people are talking about $100+ tons per carbon dioxide, and the EU is talking about 100+ euros. But 75,000 tons carbon dioxide, if you're going to put it into trees, that's photosynthesis, taking the carbon dioxide out of the air and permanently locking it into vegetation, would at that sort of cost is £2 million. Now, I'm pretty sure Manx Gas is not putting £2 million each year into carbon sequestration. And the other part of this is it's a very big area you need, because trees don't grow, it looks like they grow quickly, but the amount of carbon dioxide again, huge range of uncertainty, but 600 tons of carbon dioxide per square kilometre per year in a mature forest. Now, to start with, when they're growing, when they're small, it's a lot less, an awful lot less. But let's assume you've got a mature forest there. That would mean you would need 125 square kilometres of new forest. That's what Manx Gas would have to do in addition to everything else that other companies are doing. And it will probably cost more than £2 million for that, actually, because if you look at the Scottish uplands, if you're going to buy that, that's £15 million at least. And just 125 square kilometers compared to the area of the Isle of Man, it's a big area. And the sales from the wholesale cost of 1.1 billion cubic feet of gas is £5.5 million. So you can see that really you can't offset this easily. That's what the bottom line is. It's difficult, if not impossible, to offset this amount of carbon unless you're going to pay a lot more for gas. And to be honest, there's a lot cheaper options. Now, companies therefore may want to lower their greenhouse gas emissions. They're not being forced to in the Isle of Man yet, but how would you do that? And the only I recommend you don't read through this. It's just to say if you need some help with this, we can probably help, because there's a set of things you need to think about. Is you first of all need the baseline, then you're looking at the options and how what the cheap wins are. And then you're only looking actually probably for a short-term solution, because over the long term, there's technology and accounting being developed that may mean you have to change. And particularly there will be game changers. Hydrogen fuel being an example of one of those. And we've also got a separate list of challenges, because it really is not easy to do this. But if you need some help, we're here to help. But let's think now on the large scale. Could the Isle of Man not only be have net zero emissions from power production, but actually make money out of it? This could actually be the new economy, the new industrial sector that everybody's hoping for. There really is value in Manx natural resources. In the old days, value in energy was things like oil and gas and coal. We've moved on that. Now the value is in wind and associated things, water and steep terrain, those sort of things, and often vegetation. But one thing that's sure is we'll be back to electric again. The Isle of Man was leading at the start there on electric, and that's what we'll be, largely powering ourselves with electricity. And it's cheap and easy to generate that now. The problem is that it actually is being produced often when you don't need it. So the real value is in storage. So it's no good building 12 terawatt hours of wind energy, or 40 is what the UK. They're looking for 40 gigawatts. If no point in putting that in unless you have a way of storing the energy for when you need it. And we'll explain that in a minute. But this is why there's so much move on hydrogen, but the technology isn't ready. Just storing it is a big problem. It leaks, it's very small molecules. But nonetheless, if we can get the energy storage right, then the Isle of Man has really amazing resources now in new future energy systems. There's even, interest for tourism in it. And you see some of the things we might be talking about. I mean, here's an example: the Laxey wheel. That was a form of energy. That was utilizing hydropower. So, people come to look at these things. We'll show another example in a minute. A quick calculation says we need about 1,500 Laxey wheels to power the Isle of Man if we can turn them on and off when we need them. We probably won't go that way though. What we think that you can do is provide cheap power for local homes and businesses, and there's an opportunity for the Isle of Man to export and also to lead other islands, because other islands need help as well, particularly the poorer ones. And we would say that the funding can come from the desperation with some energy companies and certainly investors for green power. So as we move on, so yes, it should have local benefit as well as meeting global goals. That's the climate change bill is a big step, just to make sure now we do it properly, I guess. The society and economy will transform, and very large areas will be needed. And probably onshore itself is not going to be enough. We will, offshore territorial sea, and that the Isle of Man's lucky there. It has a large territorial sea. And those natural things that we sometimes curse actually got value for power. So we've been looking at various low carbon business models, specifically on energy. But just to give you an idea, the sort of thing, some of you may have visited this Hollow Mountain at Dennorig. It's a hydro scheme that is really essential to UK's energy, and this is where they store the power. It's not. They use 2 reservoirs. Neither of them are underground. All the equipment's underground, but it's still the volume of rock that has been removed is phenomenal. And when it's switched on, it can produce 8 times the Isle of Man's power requirements. And it is just one mountain with 2 reservoirs. So here was the traditional view of power. You would produce it in a power station, probably fossil fuel. You would transmit it. You would put it. You would then lower the voltage. You would stabilize the frequency, and then you would distribute it to homes. In the future, it's going to look a lot more complex, with various forms of power. Wind and solar being 2 examples. We may be using biomass as well, but if there's any fossil fuels left in the system, they will be that carbon dioxide that's being produced will be removed, and that's very expensive, and storing it is really expensive as well. Factories will also be close to, they'll be low carbon at least. And then we've got options, electric cars. It could also store energy. But the key thing all the way through here is the battery shape. It's the energy storage is the key thing, and linking that into the grid. Being able to store when the wind is blowing, store that when it's not needed, and then switch it back on quickly when it is needed. So just to show what this means, here is 2 weeks in Denmark earlier this year. The red line is demand for power. So you see it's going up and down, obviously day-night requirements. And in blue, which is the solid color, the darkest blue is the wind power production, the generation of power from wind. And, Denmark is dominated by wind power. And you can see it goes up and down, of course, because it's not always windy. In addition, there's yellow, which is solar power, which switches off at night, and in the winter it's less, and it is in the summer, of course. The price of electricity is going up and down. These are the green, and we've got West Denmark and East Denmark. But you can see when the wind power is high, the price falls. And when there is little wind being produced, the price goes up. Now, where do they get the power is twofold. First of all, the traditional way, and this is how the UK is still doing it, the traditional way is with baseload power station. In Denmark, they're using biomass power stations mostly, but that can now be problematic because basically you're producing, you can't switch power stations on and off efficiently. So they keep them running, and they're doing the same in the UK. They keep the nuclear power stations running, and there'll be more in the future. But that means there's a lot of excess energy, power being produced. And what's happened, particularly with COVID, is actually they had to switch off the wind turbines. This is called curtailing. And this is not good use of power. So the problem is we have times of surplus power now with renewable energy and times when demand greatly outstrips supply. That's all to do with the weather and the sun. If we can, so the future value is filling these troughs. And this is the whole energy storage part. If you can do that, well, first of all, you're powering the country as you need it, but you also have export, because when you know the UK needs its when it requires peak power is probably the same time as the Isle of Man and the same time in Ireland. Now, what happens actually in Europe, and will soon happen in the UK, is this excess power, some of it, the surplus power, will be exported to Norway by very large interconnectors, high voltage direct current, where in Norway they pump, they use the energy, the power, the electricity to pump water into reservoirs, and later then when Denmark needs the power, or the Netherlands, or Germany, or the UK, they will reverse that, and the electricity will then be fed back to those countries that require it at a significant hike in prices. So Norway is making a lot of money out of this, and will eventually they won't need oil and gas, because actually this is all, they've got so much water and so much room. This is a big money earner for them, is to store the excess power coming from other countries. But they couldn't manage all actually the interconnectors couldn't take all the surplus power during COVID, so they had to switch some of these off. In addition, there's high frequency variation, and what you need to make sure the grid stays stable, that you don't that you don't have a blackout, or you don't break your equipment, your electrical equipment, of course, is you need something called ancillary services, which is a whole group of things that stop the voltage varying too much, and the frequency from varying too much. That's an investment the Isle of Man will have to make, even though there would be I think that causes some fear amongst certain people, because it seems like a lot of money. But as we say, if you're going to earn a lot from it, because this is a service you could provide to other countries as well, UK and Ireland, then actually it's value rather than cost. So the big thing we're pushing is that lithium ion batteries is one way of storing wind power, but they're expensive. They're not very good for the environment. They've got a huge environmental footprint, in fact, and they don't have a very long shelf life. In fact, there's a limit to the amount of times you can reuse them. It's not really designed for grid scale storage. It might work in the car in the short to medium term, but the real thing is having hydro power storage, which is there are other options, but they're not on the scale you need. This is what Norway does. It pumps water with excess power, that pumps it up into an upper reservoir, and when the power is needed again, lets it go back down again, and provides the power. And it's a stable form of electricity as well, so it's sort of doing the balancing as well. And so we were looking at how you could do this in the Isle of Man, and it seems like a problem because you need two big reservoirs, and they need to be big. But we think we've got an idea on that. So the whole advantage is you can switch it on and off really quickly. And what the two things we're thinking about is you can use the sea as the lower reservoir. Now, of course, seawater is corrosive, so there is an extra expense. You need stainless steel, for example, but that is feasible. It's just slightly more expensive. We can have an upper reservoir that is underground, and one of the places we've been looking at is the Doon Granite. Now, again, it's more expensive to do that, but then the seawater is first of all, the reservoir is not visible, and you're not losing any seawater. It's underground, and the other alternative is doing what we call an inverse reservoir, which is essentially a lagoon, and you pump the water out of that lagoon, so you have dikes around it, and you pump that water out, and when you need, with the surplus power, and then you allow it back in essentially through tidal turbines when you need the power. You need bigger areas because you don't have the head of height, but there you can see the sort of things we're thinking about. Now, there is obviously an environmental footprint there on the seabed, but as long as you don't dry out, as long as you keep, several meters of water in there, it could actually work in favor of aquaculture. It's also could be a leisure attraction. You can put floating solar in there as well, and it may provide coastal protection, for instance, for the west coast, the Isle of Man. So we like this idea, and it would be cutting edge technology. So when we did the calculations, you could say that there's no doubt this is a cheaper. However you do the equations, it's difficult. It requires a lot of effort, but it certainly provides a lot more money for the Isle of Man. It provides money rather than you having to buy electricity, for instance, from the UK through an interconnector, and it's cheaper for the Isle of Man, and it also provides revenue, and it potentially not just exporting power, but also exporting technology and knowledge. So, when we've been fiddling around with numbers, the things that seem to come in, make sense. Offshore wind, onshore wind, onshore solar, offshore solar if you're going to do the inverse lagoon idea. Biomass is a good flexible form, but it's only small. You can't get to the scale you need to power the whole of the Isle of Man, even close to that. You need a strengthened electricity grid. Are you okay there, Rebecca? Is that, you still got me? Let me just check. Are you still there, Rebecca?
Still there, you're okay.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, just right. A strengthened electricity grid, you need the balancing and ancillary surfaces. You want an interconnector to the UK and Ireland. It could be a high voltage one to sell power, but the advantage of the AC cable is that you can sell it already packaged as the UK and Ireland need it. And then you need the storage. And that's such an amazing future for the Isle of Man. Consultants have been engaged. They're doing something called plexus modeling, but to be honest, it's been very constrained, and it's been to try and fix some ideas. The idea is really with plexus modeling is to optimize, and you can see there's so many options. That's the trick, is trying different things. It's testing ideas, and it definitely needs expert review. And the strategy, it just needs to be broad. It needs to be ambitious. It needs to be innovative, which it hasn't been, I say, up to this. I would say it's not to save costs. It's actually to make, it'll provide revenue to Isle of Man done properly. And there are ways to get companies to do all the funding, the financing. That's been the old model for oil and gas. Companies will pay to have a source of power, but the Isle of Man obviously wants to keep equity in that. what you need is a really good legislative framework, and that's where the work needs to be done as well. And there are other things you can do. You can, carbon taxes, subsidies. That's what John's been working on to promote, to make sure it's fair, that this works well, that companies and people aren't left behind. But our calculation saying it's, there was one option that's been modeled is the cost, just buying electricity from the UK. That was seen as one way of avoiding carbon emissions. But this is, you can provide a lot more value by doing it, by building an energy system on the Isle of Man that's renewable power. And there are many people looking for investments in green energy. So again, it's making sure you show yourself as serious. The Isle of Man can be seen to be a player in this. And just to show you, oil and gas companies are traditionally the ones that have had all the money, but over this is from March 2020 to start of March to start a year's fall in prices for BP, Shell, and all the rest of the companies that really have huge resources. So they are looking for ways to do what the renewable energy companies have done, is double their share price or more. Now I've also put here, at scale green energy store Isle of Man, or the Green Energy Hub. I've been changing the name a bit. Could store and sell to the UK. Now I've put a slash to U and K, because there's also a risk here that in 10 years' time the United Kingdom is no longer going to be as it currently is. Scotland could have left, and who knows what's going to happen. So you can't put all your eggs in one basket. So Ireland is good to have in there as well, and has a different pricing mechanism, so you can play the two off. The idea would be to provide maybe a free quota of off-peak energy to the public, or cheaper at least. There's lots of words here, but basically, it's getting the legislation right so you can get companies to come in, develop it for you. You don't want a Douglas Promenade problem. They take all the risk, essentially paying to be able to use Manx resources. So that will produce value. So these were the numbers we produced before. There's some extra numbers here, what it's based on, but basically, the license fees, they're worth a lot now for offshore wind power. With 800 square kilometers, you're talking about 12 terawatt hours per year, which is worth an awful lot of money if you do it properly, if it's balanced and stabilized, and can lead to an awful lot of jobs. And again, if we could be leading some new ideas if it's done properly. There's additional value, of course, because there's less and less windy shallow water now in Northwest Europe, because a lot of it's been licensed. The cost of renewables is still falling really remarkably. So there's each time you do this, it comes down. There is options for natural carbon sequestration that could include offshore as well, in the form of seaweed. And there's value in research training. The training will be a key part in the Isle of Man, but also for other islands. And if we can provide innovation for coastal areas, because that, for instance, the inverse lagoon is innovative, that if you can get it to work on the Isle of Man, which you can, then that can be exported elsewhere. And there's a lot of potential for new businesses, just on a local scale. There's obviously construction and engineering, just even house building. There's all the agricultural side of things, including producing fuels. There's rewilding, the blue economy, and of course it's the big financial sector on the Isle of Man, and it's all now about ethical and green investment. So if the Isle of Man's got its own, what a brilliant way to attract money. And going electric won't say, if you've got a buying an electric car at the moment won't do anything for the planet. In fact, it'll actually make it worse at the moment because lithium-ion batteries have such a carbon footprint. But in the long run, if all our power is renewable, maybe a better solution, this is what they do in Denmark, is have electric vehicle rental rather than purchasing. So it's a better use of resources, in fact. And then, of course, there's the whole off-island transport, of which we've got some ideas on ferries and flights. And then there's the value in the technical advice and admissions. Even labeling could be an industry on the Isle of Man, you know, saying what the carbon footprint is. So we are around. We're here to help. We're trying to promote communication and engagement, develop new ideas, do some training, and also foster some collaboration with investors in industry and small nations. The problem is we don't have any money yet, but we hope we'll get there. But if you want to be involved, we've got workshops planned. We've got these ideas of energy system builder cards, which we'll be using in we hope in future workshops, just to say here, you know, we can add to those and try different things. We're hoping to produce a film. We've got a competition idea on getting people engaged, and we want to show some demonstration technologies in Douglas and at Miltontown and Ramsey. We're building a GIS database, which is got some of the key information you need to do renewable power. And of course, we're there for advice. You know, we're going to try and keep completely, well, we will keep completely objective, do assessments for companies and short courses. So just to say that what we're saying is net zero carbon has to mean more than buying electricity from the UK. There's huge value in Isle of Man renewable resources. If we can do a homegrown approach, that will maximize things. And if we use a consortium of companies, you can avoid the financial exposure or the risk it doesn't get done on time. And I think public support will come if you're providing low cost power. Again, it'll involve obviously a lot of meetings. You know, I think we can help build a world-class, world-leading renewable energy system, and this is the new economic future for the Isle of Man. You know, there's, you know, after COVID, where we're looking for new sectors. This is it, to be honest, I think. And the question is really, is there a downside? Because we're going to have to do it anyway. So it's a complex path, but it can be optimized with research and training. I think it has to be independent of all other pressures to be completely objective. You know, it needs to also be know about the Isle of Man. It needs to be local knowledge, the relevant ideas, and slightly brave. You know, it's got to be innovative but impartial. So that was it.